Fallout 76 could have been an amazing new take on a franchise that's changed the way people look at games for 2 generations. You don't need me to tell you that it wasn't. It's Bethesda's lowest scoring full release since Rogue Warrior almost 9 years ago. While I haven't actually played the game, because it's just not the type of thing I'm interested in, I've heard enough about the game to have some ideas about how it could have been what it probably should have been. A player-driven simulation of how society rose again after the bombs dropped in 2077. As it stands right now, it seems farther from an online role-playing game and closer to a Borderlands or Destiny-style shoot-and-loot. It seems clear that this is just the type of game Bethesda wanted to make. While they certainly had the power to make my ideal Fallout 76, they chose to take it in a different direction, and that's fine. I just think we could have gotten something that felt more like an evolution of the Fallout formula rather than a step sideways. Just getting this out of the way, you need to up the player count to at least 64 or so, and make the map bigger to accommodate most of my ideas here. Making the game multiplayer doesn't mean we have to abandon role-playing. Obviously, you can't just expect every random player you meet to speak and act in character, but you can implement systems to facilitate dynamic relationships between players outside of giving a waving gesture whenever you happen to pass one. My ideal Fallout 76, as I said before, would be a player-driven simulation of society springing up again. We've seen games do this before. Ark Survival Evolved, Rust, certain DayZ servers. The number one thing that would facilitate this is player factions. The way I see it, players should be forming small or large groups, building settlements, and forming relationships, positive or negative, with other settlements. However, you can't just throw in a system to create and moderate factions and call it a day. You'll need some gameplay tweaks to balance them, and encourage players to engage in them. Right now, it seems like Fallout 76 wants its players to be lone wolves, or grouping up in parties of 4 or so, and roaming the wastes. As counterintuitive as it sounds, to make factions organically rise and fall, you'll need to discourage that roaming. If you make settling down entirely optional, you'll have too many players choosing to wander for player factions to be as big as they should be. There are 4 simple ways to facilitate this. Make the wasteland more harsh, make carry weight lower, remove the player stashes that you can access from multiple locations, and make food, water, and ammo scarcer. This way, even if you do want to hoof it alone, you'd still want to have a house, some basic defenses, and farming/ammunition forging equipment. A base of operations, however temporary or small, should virtually be a requirement to prospering. In older Fallout games, friendly NPCs had set up refuges for us to rest in, but there are no friendly NPCs in 76. So that basically covers the lone wolves. The way I see it, towns and factions are what the core game should revolve around, but you have to accommodate the lone wolf types too. They'd be setting up shop, however temporarily, and staging voyages into the dangerous wastes to quest, loot, and explore before moving on to the next location, or returning their house into a more permanent home. So how about the player factions, which would be creating not houses, but towns? Well, things get more complicated here, but I see it as the key to creating my ideal Fallout 76. There's plenty that's a given. Players would be able to create and join factions with customized emblems on their armor. You'd have building rights as in Rust, so that players wouldn't be able to build on others' property without their permission. And maybe you could even have a sort of real estate system, where faction leaders or town managers can allot each of their members a certain amount of building space within the town. There'd be security systems that would only allow faction members into certain areas, and so forth. You could even set up hotels for traveling lone wolf types to stay the night and do some trading. These are mostly all things we've seen before in games like Ark Survival Evolved, but I want to get bigger than that, so let's keep dreaming. Once a town or faction got to a certain size, you wouldn't want to be the player that was chosen to tend the crops and forge the ammo. So what if 76 had friendly NPCs that would move into town that fit prerequisites, as in Terraria, and they could tend the crops and ammunition in exchange for a safe place to live and food to eat? You could even have NPC guards, watchmen, and so forth. They don't have to give quests or even have dialogue. They just need to do the dirty work that no player wants to be stuck doing, so that the humans can do all the exciting stuff. Going out into the waste would be a dangerous and unstable source of the type of provisions a huge settlement of players needs. So going out and exploring would be for more specific reasons than finding food and ammo. Quests, searching for weapons or blueprints, and most importantly, communicating with other factions. Faction relations would be an incredibly tricky thing to balance. There need to be organic ways of keeping the huge factions from consuming and destroying smaller, fledgling towns. I have an interesting way of implementing Fallout's token morality here. What if the farming NPCs would be less likely to stay in your town based on average PvP kills of faction members and nukes your town possesses? You could still have evil factions that loot and destroy other settlements, but they would have to go full on with the killing and looting, or have human players tending to the food and ammo farming. On top of this, you can make security systems pretty easy to conjure up if you had the right skills, so that even weaker settlements could have a top-notch security system if they had one guy with decent intelligence or science skill. As a side note, do away with the whole perk cards thing, and keep character stats largely the same as they worked in the other Fallouts. Specializing is fun, random chance isn't. So the big bad settlements would have a harder time preying on weaker settlements because even weak settlements can fairly easily get powerful security systems, and they need to loot and rob even more to make up for the lack of farmers in their town. Before we jump to the big settlement politics that are my and many others' favorite aspects of Fallout lore, let's take a break by looking at more peaceful relationships between settlements big and small. There's one thing that the entire Fallout economy has always been based around: trade routes and caravans. Of course, you'd have to make sure each section of the map had certain rare items and commodities that were worth trading for. Maybe one section would be closer to a Great War blast zone and need more rataways than they could procure alone. Trade routes are another thing NPCs could handle if you set up long-term trade agreements with other settlements. You'd get enough NPCs in your town and eventually you'd have enough to safely travel down certain roads in the wastes. And if the path to other outposts required it, you could even have friendly players watch after your caravans as they went on their trade routes. If your caravan didn't return, you could send out players to search the trade routes and find out what happened. This falls into another way of accommodating lone wolf players and groups alike: custom quests. Every player should be allowed to create quests to offer to others with custom objectives and rewards. Lone wolves could, if they wanted to, act as contractors who go from town to town doing the inhabitants' quests for them. This, combined with the caravan trade route system, would even allow some lone wolf players or small gangs to act as Fallout's ever-present highwaymen. They could rob a caravan and run away laughing before anyone was ever sent to find out what happened to it. Through entirely organic, player-driven systems, factions would become friend or foe, do each other favors, start trading with each other, have problems with the local gangs, and politics would ensue. So what about when those politics turn sour? As I said before, attacking another settlement would be dangerous and require a lot of preparation and planning due to the ease of setting up effective defenses. But eventually the bubble would burst and war would break out between factions, whether it be for looting rights over an area, supplies, wanting to raid a settlement, or just because they plain don't like each other. There's one major thing that gets in the way of role-playing: respawning. This sounds far-fetched, but I think it's a necessary evil. Just have the player be knocked unconscious for a certain amount of time when they're killed. The survivor could loot their body and even take all of their money, necessitating leaving your valuables at home. And what would be really interesting is if they could take someone's clothes off their body and wear them as a disguise that would fool faction security systems. With a bit of subterfuge, spies could infiltrate settlements and place an explosive, sabotage their farms and forages, steal their equipment, or even learn some of the settlement's secrets to help plan an attack. That would be awesome. But if you're thinking like I am, you're thinking about the inevitable trolls, who would come in with high-level gear and wipe out settlements for the fun of it. Having players be knocked unconscious and ready to be plucked clean would already deter trolls, as they would need to have a vulnerable base of operations to store their valuables in order to not be set way back when they died. But what about the troll's greatest friend, the nuke? As I said before, it should be really dangerous to explore the wasteland, and getting an entire faction to have high enough level gear to storm another faction's settlement should basically require that they have a base of their own. Obviously, this would extend to nukes. To get a nuke, you should have to have incredibly specialized forging equipment that's insanely hard to manufacture, and the nuke should even be harder to manufacture than the forges. Then, to deter raiders, make the nukes totally wipe out everything on their target. You wouldn't be able to nuke a place, then run in and take all their loot. Nuking should only be for completely wiping a settlement off the map because you need them gone. So with nuking being purely for tactical reasons and not for looting reasons, you suddenly get a magical thing between rivaling factions: nuclear deterrence. Everyone in the blast zone would get a notification that a nuke was being launched and where it was headed, and it would take maybe 10 minutes for the nuke to detonate. That way the targeted town would get a chance to fire their nukes in response. Imagine how interesting it would be to have your settlement be up in arms about the town suddenly possessing nukes, and being afraid that any moment two settlements would exchange nukes. Suddenly you'd have people leaving your town, NPCs reacting similarly to nukes being made as they would to your faction's PvP kills. You'd have lone wolf types, whether they're raiders or contractors, avoiding your towns out of fear of being caught in an upcoming blast. You'd have players representing each side frantically trying to reach an agreement. It'd be magical, and it'd be entirely player-driven role-playing. Not only that, it would tie in incredibly well with Fallout's theme of humanity repeating their mistakes. It wouldn't only be intense, stressful, organic, terrifying, and fun, it would be poetic. This wouldn't just be a multiplayer shoot and loot with a Fallout skin. This would be an actual multiplayer Fallout. It would take some time, but eventually all of these systems would balance out into a player-driven ecology of raiders, settlements, explorers, adventurers, wars, and politics. Exactly as society started up again after the bombs dropped. 76 is even set earliest by far in the Fallout timeline. It would be perfect. You could imagine that a certain faction on your server eventually went on to negotiate with the NCR centuries later, in the time after Fallout 2 or New Vegas. Players would, completely organically, start society anew, and sow the seeds of future civilization as seen in the NCR or the Mojave. Bethesda could even launch updates that would poke and prod at the player-driven political systems. I like where they're going with the vaults only opening on certain dates, but what if, after a year or so, the first super mutants started appearing, or hordes of ghouls started moving through certain areas, or any number of the wildly creative things I know Bethesda's capable of coming up with. Two factions could have a stable relationship until the super mutants came along and made things way harder for them, increasing tension and potentially leading to a war. This might sound like a far-fetched fever dream, but I think that if you sand the edges off of these ideas, you'd have a truly special game that is, to its very core, a proper Fallout spin-off. Fallout has always been about stories big and small, short and long, and if Bethesda wants to make a game where NPCs don't create stories, then the players should be the ones making them.